The call came at 4:53 in the morning, the kind of hour that exists specifically to deliver the worst news. Clara Whitfield was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table of her 2-bedroom apartment in Roanoke, Virginia, working through a stack of invoices for the logistics company that paid her $11.40 an hour to reconcile numbers that never quite balanced the way they should. The fluorescent light above the stove buzzed with the particular frequency that she had learned to ignore over 19 months of living in this apartment. The same way she had learned to ignore the smell of the upstairs neighbors cooking and the sound of pipes that groaned every time the building's heating system cycled on in the night. Her phone screen lit up with a number she recognized immediately, not because it was in her contacts under any name, but because the area code was Millhaven, and anyone calling from Millhaven at 4:53 in the morning was calling about her father. She picked up before the second ring. Harold Garrison had died in his sleep sometime between midnight and the pre-dawn hours of January the 11th. The hospice nurse on the line spoke with the practiced gentleness of someone who delivered this particular kind of news regularly enough to have found the right register of voice for it. "Peaceful," the nurse said. He simply stopped breathing. There was no distress that we could see. Clara sat with the phone against her ear for a few seconds after the call ended, listening to the silence of her kitchen. Then she put the phone face down on the table and sat very still, looking at nothing in particular, while the stove light buzzed above her and the invoices waited for attention they were not going to receive tonight. She had known this was coming, had known for 8 months since the oncologist in Roanoke had delivered his assessment in the flat, careful language of a man reporting findings rather than offering hope. Had driven up to Millhaven the following Friday to sit with her father at his kitchen table and explain what the doctor had said, because Owen and Margot had not been available, and someone needed to be the one to say the words out loud. Had spent the next 8 months making that 3-hour drive every other weekend, sometimes with Nora asleep in the back seat, sometimes alone in the dark with the radio off and her hand steady on the wheel. Had filled prescriptions at the Millhaven pharmacy, had managed doctor appointments and hospice consultations, and the endless paperwork that accumulates around a person who is in the process of leaving the world. Had cooked Sunday dinners and packaged them in freezer containers labeled with heating instructions in her own handwriting, because Harold Garrison's hands had grown too unreliable to manage the stove safely, and he was too proud to say so directly. Owen had visited twice during those 8 months. Margot had come once, in October, staying for a weekend that she described to people at her Northern Virginia dinner parties as emotionally exhausting. Clara sat at her kitchen table until 5:15, and then she walked down the hallway to Nora's room and stood in the doorway watching her daughter sleep. 8 years old, dark hair fanned against the pillow, one arm thrown over the stuffed bear she had owned since she was 3 and still refused to acknowledge as babyish. In sleep, Nora looked exactly like the photographs of Clara at the same age, the same slight frown of concentration, as if even in dreams she was working through problems that required attention. Clara leaned against the doorframe and breathed slowly and thought about all the things she needed to do in the next 24 hours. And then she thought about her father, and then she stopped thinking about the next 24 hours entirely and simply stood there for a while in the particular silence of a night that had changed into something she was not yet ready to name. She called her supervisor at 6 in the morning, left a message that her father had passed, and asked for bereavement days. Then she woke Nora and explained in the simple, direct terms that she had learned were kinder than softened language. "Great-Grandpa Harold died last night," she said, kneeling beside the bed. "He was very tired, and his body needed to rest. And he went to sleep and didn't wake up. And that means he's gone now. But he wasn't in pain, and he wasn't alone." Nora absorbed this in silence for a moment. Was he scared? "I don't think so," Clara said. "I think he was ready." Will we go to Millhaven? Yes, baby. We need to go to Millhaven. Nora sat up and reached for her bear. Okay, she said, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children sometimes displayed in the face of grief. Not because they felt it less, but because they processed it differently, in pieces rather than all at once. Then, a moment later, "Can I bring Biscuit?" "You can bring Biscuit." She packed Nora's bag and then her own, moving through the small apartment with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned not to let emotion interrupt necessary action. The rent was due in 11 days. She had $417 in checking and $212 in savings. And the bereavement policy at her company covered 3 paid days, which meant anything beyond that would come out of time she did not have, and money she did not possess. She had one suit jacket suitable for a funeral, a dark navy piece she had bought secondhand 3 years ago for a job interview. She packed it wrapped in a plastic dry cleaning bag and told herself it would be fine. They left Roanoke before the sun was fully up, the car loaded with a cooler of food because restaurant meals were not in the budget, Nora in the back seat with Biscuit, and a book about deep-sea creatures that she had been working through since Christmas. The drive north through the Shenandoah Valley took 3 hours and 15 minutes in January conditions, the hills rolling gray and pale gold under a sky that couldn't decide between overcast and clear. Clara drove with both hands on the wheel and let Nora read to her from the deep-sea book, half listening to descriptions of bioluminescent creatures that lived in total darkness and made their own light, and thought about Harold Garrison in his kitchen chair, eating the soup she had left him, watching the fields through the window with the particular patience of a man who had spent his whole life watching fields. He had not been a demonstrative man, had not said much that was openly tender, but he had remembered which soup she liked from childhood and kept it on hand when she visited. And once, during one of those late Saturday evenings, when Nora was asleep in the back bedroom and Clara and her father sat in the living room with the television off, he had said, out of a long silence, that he knew she was the one who showed up, and that he did not take it for granted. He had not elaborated on this statement. They had sat in the silence after it for a few minutes, and then he had asked whether she wanted more tea, and she had said yes, and he had gotten up to make it. That was Harold Garrison's version of saying the important things. Owen's BMW was in the driveway when Clara pulled in. Margot's Lexus sat behind it. Both vehicles were waxed to a shine despite January's road grime, the kind of clean that came from regular professional detailing rather than occasional weekend washing. Clara parked her 7-year-old Civic beside them and sat for a moment looking at the farmhouse where she had grown up, its white clapboard siding gleaming in the cold morning light, the wraparound porch where Harold had kept his rocking chair until the autumn made sitting outside impractical. The house looked exactly as it always had, well-maintained, solid, smelling when you went inside of old wood, and the particular combination of coffee and the linseed oil Harold used on the furniture. It had never looked like a contested thing, and yet that was what it had become. Clara was not sure exactly when she had understood this, but she had understood it for some time. Owen met her at the door with the expression of a man conducting a meeting rather than burying a parent. 41 years old, hair that had gone silver at the temples in a way that read as distinguished rather than aged, wearing a sweater that Clara recognized as cashmere by the particular quality of its drape. He had driven up from Richmond last night when the hospice called. He had managed, he informed Clara, to make the preliminary arrangements with Harker's funeral home in town, and had contacted Pastor Elaine Morrison about the service, and had spoken briefly with Douglas Whitmore, the family attorney, who had confirmed that the reading of the will would occur the day after the funeral. "That's a lot to handle so quickly," Clara said. "Well, someone had to," Owen said. He did not mean this as a criticism. That was the particular quality of it. He said it the way a project manager describes a task that was on the timeline, efficiently, and without apparent awareness of how it landed. Margot was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a mug of the good coffee that lived in the back cabinet, the kind Harold kept for visitors. 39 years old, hair that cost a significant amount to look as naturally blonde as it appeared, wearing the kind of casual clothes that were actually quite expensive. Her husband Daniel was not present. He had stayed in Northern Virginia with the children, Margot explained, because pulling the kids out of school midweek had seemed unnecessary, given that Harold had not been particularly involved in their lives. She offered this information in a tone that suggested she had considered the matter carefully and arrived at a reasonable conclusion. Clara put her bag in her childhood bedroom, which had been updated since she left it in the way that guest rooms were updated. The furniture replaced with something more neutral, the photographs removed from the walls and placed in a box in the closet. Nora settled onto the bed with Biscuit and her book, pulling her coat off and making the unconscious adjustments that children made to new spaces. "This used to be Mommy's room," she observed. "It doesn't look like you anymore." "Things change," Clara said. Nora considered this. "Does Great-Grandpa's room still look like him?" Clara's throat tightened. "Yes, baby. It still looks like him." The funeral was held 2 days later at Millhaven Presbyterian, at a white church with a steepled roof that Harold had attended reliably every Sunday for 53 years, and where he had served on the building committee for 11 of them. The attendance was better than Clara expected, the pews filling with farmers he had known for decades, neighbors, the pharmacist who had filled his prescriptions with practiced patients when Harold's hands made the child-safe caps difficult, the woman from the hardware store who had held his account through 3 dry seasons and never pressed him about it. These were the people who had known him as a constant, as a particular kind of reliable presence that rural communities generated and depended upon, and did not always recognize as essential until it was gone. Owen delivered a eulogy that was well constructed and sincerely felt in its way, decovering Harold's service record, his business acumen, his dedication to the farm. Margot sat in the front pew and cried with an elegance that looked practiced, dabbing at her eyes with a folded handkerchief while keeping her mascara perfectly intact. Clara sat at the end of the row with Nora pressed against her side and her hands folded in her lap, and she listened to her brother describe their father in terms that were accurate but incomplete, the way a biography written by someone who read the subject's records rather than knew the subject was accurate but incomplete. Nora whispered against Clara's arm at one point during the service. "That man, talking about Great-Grandpa. Did he visit a lot?" "No," Clara said quietly. Nora absorbed this. "Then how does he know all this stuff?" Clara looked at her daughter. "You can know facts about a person without really knowing them," she said. "That's not the same thing." Nora appeared to file this information away for future consideration, which was how she handled concepts that required more processing time. After the service, in the parking lot of Millhaven Presbyterian, while Clara was helping Nora button her coat against the January wind, she overheard Owen and Margot talking near Owen's car. They were not attempting to be private about it. The conversation was clipped and certain, the way conversations were when the participants had already settled the important questions and were simply confirming logistics. "Whitmore said the reading is Thursday at 10, Margot said. "Does she know what to expect?" Owen's answer came with a pause that Clara recognized as the pause of a man who had considered whether to say something directly and decided the indirect version was more comfortable. "It's Dad's will," he said. "What he wanted is what he wanted." Clara heard this and turned away and helped Nora finish with her buttons, smoothing the collar flat, buying herself the 3 seconds it took to get her face arranged into something neutral. She had not read the will, had never asked to, had simply trusted in the way that she trusted most things, by doing the work that was in front of her and believing that reasonable people behaved reasonably in the end. Standing in that parking lot in the January wind, watching her brother hold open the door of his BMW for the sister who had come once in 8 months, Clara began to understand that she had been operating on an assumption that no one else shared. Douglas Whitmore's office occupied the second floor of a building on Millhaven's Main Street, its waiting room furnished with the particular combination of worn leather and faded adequacy that suggested a practice established decades ago by someone more interested in competence than atmosphere. Whitmore himself was in his early 70s, white-haired, with the careful manner of a man who had learned long ago that the documents he read aloud in that room tended to produce reactions that required management. He greeted Clara and Owen and Margot with equal courtesy, settled them in the 3 chairs arranged facing his desk, and opened the file folder in front of him with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who understood that the next 30 minutes were going to be significant and saw no reason to rush significance. The will had been drafted 14 months before Harold's death and had not been amended. Whitmore read it in the order it was written, his voice steady and evenly paced. To Owen Garrison, his firstborn, Harold left the farmhouse and the western 200 acres, including the barn and all outbuildings attached to that parcel, along with the 1978 John Deere that had been in the family for 4 decades, and whatever personal effects Owen wished to claim from the house. The assessed value of this bequest was $1.2 million. To Margot Garrison Bale, his daughter, Harold left the eastern 140 acres of cleared farmland, along with the farm equipment stored in the secondary storage building, the livestock remaining on the property at the time of his death, and the accounts held at Millhaven First Federal in Harold's name, which totaled $214,000. The assessed value of this bequest, including liquid assets, was approximately $708,000. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her breathing careful and even, and her face arranged into the expression she had been practicing in the parking lot of Millhaven Presbyterian. To Clara Garrison Whitfield, his youngest child, Whitmore said, "Harold leaves the old Springhouse structure on the eastern quarter of the property, together with the natural spring rights attached thereto, and the 0.8 acres of land immediately surrounding the structure." Whitmore paused, not for dramatic effect, but because he was a methodical man who paused at natural breaks in the text. He looked up briefly over his glasses at Clara, and then looked back down at the document. The structure is described in the property records as a stone springhouse, original construction approximately 1843, located on the eastern boundary near the creek line. Assessed value of the parcel, structure included, is $4,200. $4,200. The number settled into the room the way certain numbers settled, with a weight disproportionate to its size. Owen cleared his throat. Margot uncrossed and recrossed her ankles. Neither of them looked at Clara. Whitmore continued reading the remaining provisions, which concerned the distribution of minor personal effects and the designation of Owen as executor. Clara heard the words without processing them in sequence, catching fragments, the phrase in accordance with Harold's expressed wishes, the phrase each of his children according to his judgment, the phrase to be distributed without contest, as is his clear intention. When Whitmore finished reading and closed the folder and looked up, the room held the particular quality of silence that follows the delivery of something that everyone present had been expecting, but no one had said out loud. "Well," Owen said, folding his hands on his knee, in a gesture Clara recognized as their father's. "That's what Dad wanted. We have to respect that." "Of course," Margot said. She looked at her phone briefly, then put it away. It's just the Springhouse. No, it's basically a ruin. It hasn't been used for storage in years." Clara said nothing for a moment. Outside the window of Whitmore's office, a truck passed on the main street, its tires sending up a thin spray of January slush. She watched the spray settle and thought about her father sitting at his kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon 3 months ago, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands, saying nothing in particular. She thought about the way he had looked out the window at the fields, the way he had said, on one of those evenings before she drove back to Roanoke, "You understand this place in a way the others don't." She had taken that as a father saying something kind. She had not taken it as instruction. She looked at Whitmore. "Is there a deed for the Springhouse parcel?" "There is." He opened a second folder and removed a single sheet, placing it on the desk in front of her. Clara picked it up and looked at it. The deed was 2 pages. The property described in the old surveyor's language of metes and bounds, beginning at the iron pin at the northeast corner of the spring lot, thence south 42 degrees west along the creek line. The Springhouse structure was described in a subordinate clause as an existing stone building of historical character. The assessed value was listed in the lower right corner. $4,200. Margot made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the same general territory. She covered it with a cough. "I'm sorry," she said, in the tone of someone who was not particularly sorry. "But what exactly are you going to do with a stone Springhouse that's falling apart and worth $4,000? Clara folded the deed carefully along its existing crease lines and placed it in the outer pocket of her purse. "Whatever I can," she said. Owen spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable concern. "Clara, you know Dad loved you. This isn't a reflection of that. But practically speaking, the Springhouse is worthless. It's a ruin. The roof has been leaking since 2015, and nobody's touched it. You can't live in it. You can't sell it for anything meaningful. If you want, we can look at what it would take to buy you out of it. Give you something for it." "What would you give me?" Clara asked. Owen and Margot exchanged a glance that contained an entire conversation. $4,000 is the assessed value," Margot said. "We could offer $5, so maybe $6,000, given that it has no practical use." Clara looked at the deed in her purse. Then she looked at her brother and sister. Then she said the thing that she had been working toward since the moment Whitmore finished reading, the thing that had formed itself quietly in the 4 seconds between hearing $4,200 and hearing Owen's voice fill the silence. "I'm keeping it," she said. This produced a pause. Owen leaned forward slightly. "Clara, be reasonable. The structure is barely standing. You live in Roanoke. What are you going to do? Drive 3 hours each way to visit a stone shed in a field?" Margot made the not-quite laugh sound again, not bothering to cover it this time. She said something to Owen in the undertone of people who have decided the conversation is essentially finished, and Clara caught the words, "Bless her heart," which was not a blessing. "I'm keeping the Springhouse," Clara said again. She picked up her coat from the chair back and stood. She thanked Douglas Whitmore for his time. She walked out of his office, down the stairs, and through the door of the building onto the main street of Millhaven, and she stood for a moment in the January wind, with the deed in her purse and $417 in her checking account, and the 4-hour round trip back to Roanoke waiting at the end of this day, and she let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly as long as she was standing outside, where no one who knew her could see her face. Then she put on her coat and went to get her daughter. She told Nora about the Springhouse that night. So after they had eaten the sandwiches Clara had packed in the cooler, and Nora had finished her bath in the farmhouse's upstairs bathroom, and they were sitting on the edge of the guest bed together, Biscuit positioned between them as a neutral party. She kept the explanation simple and honest, because Nora was the kind of child who responded better to simple honesty than to careful management of information. "Great-grandpa left me the old Springhouse," she said, "the little stone building out by the eastern field. Everything else in the will went to Uncle Owen and Aunt Margot, but the Springhouse is ours." Nora considered this. "The whole building?" "The whole building," Clara said, "and a little bit of land around it. Is it nice?" "I haven't seen it in a long time," Clara said, "but it's ours, and that means we can decide what to do with it." Nora thought about this for a moment, turning it over in the way she turned over things that needed thinking. "Is this like when you say something seems bad, but it might actually be okay later?" "Something like that," Clara said. Nora reached for Biscuit and tucked him under her arm. "Okay," she said. "Can we look at it before we leave?" "Yes, baby. We can look at it tomorrow." The Springhouse sat at the eastern edge of the Garrison property, where the cleared farmland met a line of hardwood trees that marked the creek. Clara drove out to it the following morning with Nora in the passenger seat, following the dirt track that ran along the fence line from the main farmhouse. The track was muddy from January thaw, and her tires picked up red clay that she was going to have to deal with before they got back onto the paved road. The January light was flat and pale, turning everything the particular shade of gray gold that characterized the Virginia winter landscape. She saw the Springhouse before she reached it, when they came around the bend in the track where the fence made its corner. It appeared between the bare branches of two old sycamores, and the first thing Clara registered was that it was smaller than she remembered it from childhood. Or perhaps not smaller, exactly, but more diminished than memory had preserved it. The way places you associated with being a child always appeared diminished when you returned to them as an adult, the scale recalibrated by the intervening years. The structure was perhaps 12 feet by 14 feet, built of the local fieldstone that Harold's grandfather had gathered from the land itself when the county was new and stone was the most available building material, and there was no reason not to use what the ground provided. The walls were substantial, 2 feet thick at least, mortared in the old way with lime rather than Portland cement. The roof was a different story. Corrugated tin, not original to the 1843 construction, but added at some point in the early 20th century by someone who had decided the original slate was more trouble than it was worth, and the tin had corroded through in 3 places, visible from where Clara stood. 3 dark, rust-edged gaps that would let weather in without discretion. One side of the Springhouse had subsided slightly, from the eastern wall showing a diagonal crack from the foundation level to about halfway up, where the settling had pushed the stones out of their original line. Lichen covered the north face entirely, a pale green-gray fur that softened the stone in a way that might have seemed charming in a photograph and was considerably less charming when you were calculating structural integrity. A wooden door, which had once been painted red and was now the gray-brown of weathered, unpainted wood, hung from one iron hinge on its left side, the right hinge having rusted through completely at some point that no one had gotten around to addressing. Nora leaned forward in the passenger seat, studying the building through the windshield with an expression that Clara recognized as the look her daughter wore when she was deciding whether to be frightened or interested. "It's really old," Nora said. 1843, Clara said. "Was that before cars?" "Way before cars." Nora accepted this. "It looks like it has a beard," she said, meaning the lichen on the north wall. "It does a little," Clara agreed. She turned off the engine and they sat for a moment, both of them looking at the Springhouse through the windshield, while the car ticked with the sound of cooling metal. The structure was framed by the bare sycamores on either side, and the line of bare hardwoods behind it, along the creek, and against the pale January sky, it had the particular quality of things that have survived longer than anyone expected them to. Not because they were protected, but simply because they were solid enough and neglected enough to avoid the fate of things that attracted attention. Clara pulled her coat tighter and opened the car door. The ground around the Springhouse was soft from the thaw, her boots sinking slightly with each step. Nora followed close behind, her hand finding Clara's without being asked, which was how Nora expressed uncertainty about new situations. Clara squeezed her daughter's hand once and then let it loosen slightly, not releasing it, but allowing movement within it, which was how she communicated that something was uncertain, but not dangerous. They stopped in front of the door. Up close, the ironwork on the surviving hinge was something Clara had not expected, heavy and hand-forged in the old style, with a detail to its construction that went beyond purely functional. Someone had put care into this door's hardware. She noticed this in passing and filed it away in the part of her mind that stored details without yet knowing their significance. She pushed the door carefully. It resisted, not because the lock held, there was no lock, but because the settling of the foundation had shifted the doorframe slightly out of true, warping the plane that the door was meant to occupy. She applied steady pressure, working the door into the gap, and it opened with a sound that was both protest and surrender, a low scraping that sent a pigeon erupting from somewhere in the interior rafters and out through one of the roof gaps before either of them could track where it had come from. Nora made a startled sound and pressed against Clara's side, and then laughed at herself for being startled, the 2-second emotional reset that 8-year-olds managed with an efficiency adults spent years trying to recover. The interior of the Springhouse was one room, the full 12 by 14 feet of the structure's footprint, with a ceiling that ran to the peak of the roof at roughly 10 feet at its apex. Cold in the way that stone buildings held cold, not the moving cold of wind, but the still settled cold of mass and shadow, a temperature that existed independent of the season outside. The light came in through 2 small windows, set high in the east and west walls, original windows framed in the old way with hand-planed wooden sills, and through the 3 gaps in the roof where rust had eaten through the tin. The pigeon that had fled had evidently been a long-term resident. The evidence of this was distributed across the floor with the thoroughness of a pigeon that felt no ambivalence about its tenancy. Along the north wall, a shallow channel had been cut into the stone floor, perhaps 8 inches wide and 6 inches deep, running from the back wall to a low opening in the base of the south wall that let it exit to the outside. This was the spring channel, the functional heart of the structure. Clara could hear the water before she saw it, a small, clear sound under everything else, and when she looked into the channel, she could see it moving, thin and steady, carrying itself through the stone trough with the indifference of water that had been doing this since 1843 and had no intention of stopping. The spring still ran. After all of this time, in January, when with everything else about this structure in some state of deterioration, the spring still ran clean and cold through its channel. "Mommy," Nora said, stepping carefully over the evidence of the pigeon and moving to the channel. She crouched beside it, peering in. "The water's still going." "Still going," Clara agreed. Nora reached her fingers toward the water, then looked up. "Can I touch it?" "Yes, baby." Nora trailed her fingers in the spring water and made a sound of surprised delight. "It's so cold. It's really, really cold." "Spring water is always cold," Clara said. "That's the whole point. They built this to keep food cool before there were refrigerators. The spring water kept the temperature low." Nora withdrew her fingers and dried them on her coat with the absent-minded thoroughness of a child who had already moved on to the next thing. She looked around the room with the comprehensive survey of someone cataloging her inventory. "There's bird poop everywhere," she observed. "We'll deal with that. The roof has holes. We'll deal with that too." "Can we really?" Nora turned to look at Clara with an expression that was asking a different question than the literal one, asking whether this was the kind of thing that Clara said and meant, or the kind of thing that adults said to manage situations and then quietly did not follow through on. Clara looked around the interior of the Springhouse. The walls were solid. 2 feet of fieldstone did not become less solid. The foundation was stone as well, set below. Grade the way old structures were set, the building's footprint resting on a continuous stone course that had settled but had not failed. The structural damage was the diagonal crack in the east wall, which would need pointing and possibly bracing, and the roof, which would need replacement, and the door, which needed a new hinge and a frame leveled back into plumb. None of this was beyond the capacity of someone determined enough and patient enough and willing to learn what she did not already know. "Yes," Clara said, "we really can." Nora appeared satisfied with this. She began moving along the perimeter of the room, running her hand along the stone wall, leaving little finger trails in the thin layer of dust and lichen that had accumulated on the interior face. She had the exploratory quality of a child who felt ownership of a space and was taking physical inventory of it, an instinctive staking of claim through touch. Oh, it was in this movement around the perimeter that Nora said the thing that lodged itself in Clara's chest and stayed there for the rest of the day. She stopped in the middle of the room and looked at the floor. "Mommy, these stones are different." Clara looked up from the east wall crack she had been examining. "What do you mean?" Nora pointed downward. "These ones in the middle. They're different from the ones around the edges." Clara walked over and looked at the floor properly for the first time since entering, not glancing at it as a surface, but looking at it as an object. The floor of the Springhouse was laid in fieldstone, matching the walls, irregular shapes fitted together with the same lime mortar, the same general construction language. But Nora was right. There was a difference. The perimeter stones ran in a rough course along the walls, old and dark and settled, covered in a fine particulate accumulation that spoke of decades undisturbed. The central area of the floor, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet, was stone as well. But the stones there were lighter in color. Not dramatically so, but perceptibly, the way a repair patch in plaster reads differently from the original surface, even after it has been painted over. And the mortar between them. Clara crouched now, looking closely. The mortar between the central stones was a slightly different composition, with a Portland cement aggregate that had not been used in this region until the early 20th century at the earliest. The perimeter floor was 1843 construction. The central floor was not. Clara pressed her palm flat against one of the central stones, and it was cold, as the whole structure was cold. But there was something else beneath the cold, or perhaps within it. The way you could feel the difference between ice resting on water and ice resting on solid ground. Not warmth exactly, but the suggestion of space, the implication of depth. She rapped her knuckles against the stone the way she had knocked on melons at the grocery store since childhood, the automatic test for density and solidity. The sound it returned was not the thick, absorbed knock of solid stone laid on packed earth. It was something else, something lower in pitch, something that traveled further before it stopped. "Hollow," Nora said, before Clara could find the word herself. Clara looked at her daughter. "It sounds hollow," Nora said, "like when I knock on the table versus when I knock on my lunchbox." Clara knelt fully on the floor of the Springhouse and pressed both hands flat against two adjacent central stones. She could feel, or thought she could feel, the faint differential in temperature between the perimeter stones and these, as if the air below the central section were larger in volume, as if the space beneath was not simply the 6 inches of packed earth and rubble fill that underlay the perimeter stones, but something considerably more generous than that. She stood and turned slowly, looking at the whole floor from a standing position, looking at it as a pattern rather than a collection of individual pieces. The central section, 8 feet by 8 feet, was oriented slightly differently from the perimeter, the dominant grain of the stones running north-south rather than following the angular irregularity of the fieldstone. And now that she was looking for it, she could see that the central section had no mortar connection to the perimeter. The gap between them was filled, but not bonded, filled with a material that had been tamped and dressed to match, but had not been keyed in. The central section of the floor was a lid. Clara's heart was beating in a way she had not expected, a slow, heavy regularity that was louder than it should have been in the cold quiet of the Springhouse. She pressed her hand against the nearest central stone one more time. The hollow sound returned, patient and definite. Nora stood beside her, biscuit tucked under one arm, looking at the floor with the calm interest of someone who found this genuinely fascinating rather than alarming. "What do you think is under there?" Clara looked at the floor. She thought about her father turning his coffee mug in his hands. She thought about him saying, "You understand this place in a way the others don't." She thought about the way he had looked out the window at the eastern field in particular, not the western fields where the farmhouse and the barn sat, not the cleared acreage that had just become Owen's and Margot's, but east, toward the creek line, toward the sycamores and the old stone building that nobody had used in years, and that he had assessed, in his final will, at $4,200. She thought about how Harold Garrison had never done anything carelessly in his life. "I don't know yet," she said to her daughter, "but I think we need to find out." Nora looked up at her. "When?" Clara straightened. She looked at the cracked east wall, at the rusted tin roof with its 3 gaps, at the warped doorframe, at the running spring that had outlasted everything around it by simply continuing to do what it was built to do. She looked at the $4,200 inheritance that her brother and sister had dismissed with something between pity and amusement. And she thought about the $47 in her wallet, and the rent due in 11 days, and the 3-hour drive back to Roanoke, and the suit jacket she had bought second-hand for a job interview. She thought about her father's hands turning the coffee mug. She thought about the floor. Soon, she told Nora. Very soon. Outside, in the pale January light, the Springhouse stood between its 2 bare sycamores, solid and patient and still. The water ran in its channel, cold and clear, the way it had run since before anyone now living had been born. And beneath the stones that Clara Whitfield was already planning how to move, something waited with the particular patience of things that have been waiting a very long time and have learned not to be in any hurry about it. She drove back to Roanoke with the hollow sound following her. It was not a sound she could hear inside the car, of course, with the heater running and the road noise, and Nora asking questions from the passenger seat about whether they could get a dog someday, and whether spring water was safe to drink, and whether the stones in old buildings had names the way bricks did. It was a sound she carried internally, below the threshold of hearing, occupying the same frequency as things that required attention before you were ready to give them attention. The knock of her knuckles against the central floor stones, the lower pitch of the return, the particular resonance of something hollow, waiting beneath something solid. The first week back in Roanoke was the kind of week that accumulates pressure the way water accumulates behind a dam, quietly and in all the wrong places at once. The bereavement days ran out. She returned to the night shift on a Wednesday, sliding back into the fluorescent routine of invoices and reconciliation and the buzzing stove light, telling herself the routine was steadying and half believing it. The rent cleared on the 14th, taking the checking account to $89 and leaving her calculating the period until next payday with the focused arithmetic of someone who had been doing this calculation regularly enough to have it memorized. Nora needed new shoes. The Civic needed an oil change that was already overdue by 800 miles. The logistics company's January had been slow, and the supervisor had mentioned in passing that overtime authorization had been frozen through the end of the month, which was the kind of information delivered casually, precisely because the people delivering it didn't need to worry about it. Clara sat with these numbers the way she sat with difficult documents at work, not avoiding them but looking at them straight until she had understood their full shape and could begin to think about the shape of the response. She was awake at 2 a.m. on the Saturday after the funeral, the apartment quiet around her. Nora sleeping in her room with Biscuit, and the deep-sea book splayed open on the pillow beside her, when her phone lit with a call from an area code she had not expected to hear from again so quickly. Douglas Whitmore's voice was careful and measured in the way it had been in his office, the voice of a man who chose words with professional deliberateness. He apologized for calling at an unusual hour. He had seen a light in her window when he worked late, he explained. But he said this in the way of someone offering a reason rather than an excuse. There was a matter, he said, that he had intended to raise at the reading of the will and had not raised, not from negligence, but from uncertainty about the appropriate moment. He had a sealed letter from Harold Garrison, one that Harold had asked him to hold and deliver to Clara personally and separately from the will proceedings, and given the circumstances of the reading, Whitmore had felt that the appropriate moment had not presented itself that day. He had debated calling sooner. He had ultimately decided that sooner was better than the alternative. Clara said she could come to Millhaven. No, Whitmore said. I'd prefer to meet you somewhere. Your brother and sister are not present, and I don't want this to wait for another trip. I'm going to read you what the letter says, and I want you to understand that I'm doing so with Harold's explicit instruction that this communication was private, for you alone. Do you understand what I'm saying? Clara sat very still at her kitchen table. Yes, she said. I understand. She heard the sound of paper being unfolded, and then she heard her father's voice. Not literally. Harold Garrison had not recorded himself, but the particular voice that a person's written words carried when you had known them your whole life, the cadence and the syntax that were uniquely theirs, the way even a note left on a refrigerator was identifiable as having come from a specific mind. Douglas Whitmore read, and Clara listened, and it was the closest thing she would have to another conversation with her father. Harold had written the letter by hand, 7 weeks before his death, on 3 sheets of plain white paper. He had begun by saying that he owed Clara an explanation, and that he had struggled to decide whether to give her this explanation before he died, or to let the discovery happen on its own, and that he had ultimately decided on a middle path, which was this letter, delivered after. He had reasons for this, he wrote. They would become apparent. So he then said the following, in language that was direct in the way Harold Garrison's language was always direct, without embellishment, but not without weight. There is something beneath the Springhouse floor that I should have told you about years ago. I did not, for reasons that I believed were sound at the time, and that I am less certain about now. In 1974, when I inherited this farm from my father, I also inherited a secret that he passed to me without ceremony, the way he passed most things, by showing me where it was and saying nothing about it except that it was mine to keep now. I kept it. I added to it over the following 5 decades, because once you understand what something is worth, it is difficult to stop the understanding from directing your actions. I am not a greedy man. Now, I want to say that clearly because I am aware that what I am about to tell you might make it appear otherwise. I am a careful man. There is a difference, though I am aware that the difference can be difficult to see from the outside. Beneath the central stones of the Springhouse floor, you will find a vault that my father constructed in 1951 with the help of a man named Elias Boone, who was a stonemason and a veteran, and who kept his word about keeping it private until the day he died in 1988. The vault is concrete, reinforced, sealed against moisture by a method that Elias designed himself and that has held for 73 years and will hold for more. The door is steel, 8 inches thick, a naval surplus piece that my father acquired through a contact whose name I have long since forgotten. It is operated by a combination that I will give you at the end of this letter, and by a key that you will find behind the loose stone in the north wall of the Springhouse, 3rd stone from the left at shoulder height. The stone rotates on a horizontal axis. Behind it, taped to the wall, is the key in an envelope with your name on it. I put it there 12 years ago when I decided that you were the one who would eventually need it. Inside the vault, you will find what my father began, and I continued. I will not describe it here in its entirety, because the description would take more than this letter, and because I think some things deserve to be discovered rather than reported. I will tell you that it is worth considerably more than $4,200. So I will tell you that I left you the Springhouse and not the farmhouse, because this is where the thing that matters actually is. Owen and Margot received land and money. You received the thing I valued most, which was the accumulated work of a family that understood the meaning of patient accumulation. I am sorry if the manner of this causes you difficulty. I believe, when you understand the full picture, that you will see the logic in it. You were always the one who understood the long view. There is a second letter inside the vault, in a sealed envelope on the desk. Read that one alone, when you have had time to understand what you are looking at. The combination is 1438722. Left, right, the way they teach you. The phone line was quiet for a moment after Whitmore finished reading, so Clara was aware of her own breathing and the sound of the refrigerator cycling and the buzzing of the stove light. "There is one more thing," Whitmore said. "Harold asked me to tell you, verbally, that the vault was not included in the estate inventory. It is not part of the assessed value of the Springhouse parcel. The Springhouse was assessed as land and structure only. What is inside the vault is not part of the estate and was not subject to probate. It is a private asset attached to a private structure on land that is now yours by deed. Do you understand the significance of what I'm telling you?" Clara understood the significance of what he was telling her. It meant the vault and its contents were not subject to division, not subject to the will, and not subject to Owen and Margot and their lawyers and their expressed opinions about what fairness looked like. It meant Harold had structured this with the particular precision of a man who had thought it through far enough in advance to make certain it could not be undone by the mechanisms that undid most things. She thanked Douglas Whitmore. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after hanging up. Then she went to the window and stood looking out at the parking lot of her apartment building, the familiar gray expanse of it, the yellow line of the light on the pavement, and the shape of her Civic with its overdue oil change. And she thought about her father saying, "You understand this place in a way the others don't." And she thought about what it meant to understand the long view. And she thought about a vault, constructed in 1951, that had held for 73 years, and would hold for more. She drove back to Millhaven the following Saturday. Nora spent the night at her friend Caden's house, a standing arrangement that Caden's mother had offered some months ago, and that Clara accepted with the particular gratitude of someone who needed a night alone more than they were comfortable admitting. She left Roanoke at 5 in the morning, before the sky lightened, with a thermos of coffee and a bag that contained a crowbar, a 2-pound hammer, a chisel set, 2 flashlights, a pair of work gloves, and a change of clothes. She stopped for gas once, in a town whose name she forgot before she reached the highway again. And she drove the rest of the way in the flat dark of a February morning with the radio off and her hands steady, and the combination her father had left her running in the back of her mind, like a set of numbers she was committed to not forgetting. 1438, 722. Left, right, left, right, the way they teach you. She arrived at the Springhouse before 8, parking the Civic on the dirt track and walking the last 100 yards in boots that were heavier than her usual shoes, made for the kind of work that required protection from edges and weight. The morning was cold and still. No wind, the bare sycamores throwing long shadows east in the early light. The Springhouse sat between them exactly as it had 2 weeks ago, unchanged, patient. The weathered door, the cracked east wall, the lichen on the north face. She found the loose stone without difficulty. Third from the left, at shoulder height on the north wall interior, just as Harold had said. She pressed it at the left edge and felt it rotate inward on its horizontal axis, smoothly, the pivot point well maintained in a way that suggested it had been opened recently, or had been constructed to precise tolerances that resisted time. Behind it, in a shallow space cut into the wall's thickness, an envelope was taped to the stone with packing tape that had yellowed but held. On the front, in Harold's handwriting, Clara. She put the envelope in her jacket pocket unopened. She would read it when she was supposed to, after she understood what she was looking at. She pressed the stone back into place and heard it settle. Then she looked at the central floor. In the 2 weeks since she had first noticed the difference, she had done research on her phone in the spare moments of her night shift, reading about Springhouse construction, about vault design, about pre-1933 American gold coinage, about the history of private precious metal storage, about the thing her father had described as accumulated work without being more specific. She had not done this research because she had formed a clear expectation of what she would find. She had done it because she needed to be standing in this room with some framework for understanding, and no framework existed until you built one. She pulled on her work gloves and began at the edge of the central section. The work of removing the stones was harder than she had anticipated and easier than she had feared. The mortar between the central stones and the perimeter was not bonded, as she had noticed in her first visit, but it was tamped and pressed to a depth that required the chisel to find the seam and the hammer to persuade it open. She worked methodically, starting at the corner of the central section nearest the spring channel, driving the chisel in, levering it gently, feeling for the line of least resistance. The first stone moved after 11 minutes. It was roughly the size of a large book, heavier than it looked in the way that stone always was, and she set it aside carefully, positioned so she could replace it in its orientation without confusion. The second stone came out in 8 minutes, now that she understood the technique. The third in 6. She worked in silence except for the tapping of the hammer and the sound of the water in its channel and occasional distant sounds from the direction of the county road. The cold kept her from sweating heavily, which was a mercy. By 10 o'clock, she had removed 19 stones, and the shape of what was beneath them was becoming visible. The subfloor was concrete, reinforced, with a surface texture that spoke of careful hand finishing rather than poured uniformity. It was smooth and gray and clean, relatively, for something that had been under a stone floor for decades. And it was interrupted, in the center of the exposed section, by the recessed shape of a steel door seated flush with the concrete surface, its frame sunk into the subfloor to eliminate any raised edge that might betray its presence to someone walking above it. The door was perhaps 3 feet square, made of dark steel that had been treated with something that had prevented rust, cosmoline or a similar preservative, its surface dull and matte rather than reflective. In the center of the door, a combination lock, and below it, recessed flush with the door's face, a keyhole. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a moment. Her hands inside the work gloves were warm from the exertion, and her knees were aching from the stone floor, and she was more certain than she had been of anything in years, that what lay beneath this door was the reason Harold Garrison had left her $4,200 instead of whatever would have felt like fairness to an outside observer. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the envelope. The key was inside it, a single brass key on a plain ring, its teeth worn smooth with age. Also inside the envelope, a note in the same handwriting as the letter Douglas Whitmore had read to her, 3 sentences only. The lock is stiff. Take your time with it. I'm sorry I did not tell you sooner, but I think you will understand why when you see it. She understood the apology. She was not sure yet whether she accepted it. She filed this question for later. The combination lock required patience. Harold had been right that it was stiff, the mechanism resistant with the particular stubbornness of precision components that had not been operated in some time. She worked through the numbers twice before the internal mechanism released, with a sound that was surprisingly quiet for its weight, a soft, definite click that traveled up through the door and into her hands. Then the key, which required more effort, the lock turning slowly and with resistance before it cleared. She gripped the recessed handle set into the door's face and pulled upward. The door was heavier than any other thing she had ever lifted with her own hands. She estimated its weight later, when she had something to compare it to, at close to 400 pounds. But the hinges were counterbalanced in a way that her father or grandfather must have engineered specifically for this purpose, a mechanism of springs and counterweights built into the frame that brought the door up from horizontal to vertical with a manageable resistance rather than the dead weight of 400 pounds of steel. She stood with the door balanced open, breathing, and looked down. A steel ladder descended into darkness below the subfloor, its rungs spaced evenly, the metal cool and solid when she gripped the top one with her gloved hand. She took the flashlight from her bag and switched it on and aimed it down. The beam reached the bottom of the shaft, perhaps 12 feet below, and illuminated a concrete floor and the lower edge of what appeared to be a larger space beyond. She went down slowly, one rung at a time, the flashlight tucked into the crook of her arm and the bag left on the surface above. The shaft was narrow enough that her shoulders brushed both sides slightly. The smell that reached her as she descended was distinct and familiar from the research she had done during her night shifts. The specific mineral quality of controlled air, cool and slightly metallic. The smell of a sealed space that had been designed to maintain a stable environment and had succeeded. No mold, no damp, no rot, just the particular still air of somewhere that had been sealed with intention and precision. She stepped off the bottom rung onto the concrete floor and straightened and turned the flashlight outward. The vault was not a closet. It was a room, approximately 20 feet by 16 feet, its ceiling at 8 feet, the walls concrete poured in place with visible form marks still readable in the surface. The room was divided by a system of custom-built steel shelving that ran from floor to ceiling along 3 walls, each shelf approximately 14 inches deep, mounted to the concrete, with hardware that her contractor's eye recognized as overkill in the best possible sense. The 4th wall, the one directly opposite the ladder shaft, held a narrow steel desk, a folding chair, and a brass reading lamp connected to a power source she could not yet identify. On the desk, a sealed envelope with her name on it. She made herself look at the shelving before she went to the desk. She made herself do this deliberately, because she understood that the desk contained information and the shelving contained the thing itself, and she needed to look at the thing itself while her understanding was still without the framework of numbers. The shelving held cases, airtight display cases of the kind used for archival storage of sensitive materials, each one sealed with a rubber gasket along its perimeter, each one labeled in Harold's handwriting on a small card affixed to the front. Inside each case, laid on velvet of a dark blue that was almost black, coins. Row upon row of coins, all arranged in the organized manner of someone who had been cataloging for decades, each coin resting in its own recess, each recess sized to that specific coin's diameter, nothing shifting or touching its neighbor. The coins caught the flashlight and returned it, and the quality of the return was the quality of metal that had been kept in controlled darkness and was encountering light with something that would have been surprise in a thinking thing. She walked slowly along the first shelf, reading the small cards without touching the cases. The cards were written in abbreviated numismatic notation that she had spent part of her week learning enough of to read at a basic level. She understood, as she read, that the abbreviations represented grades of condition, that the numbers following the grades represented years of minting, and that the denominations she was reading were American gold coins spanning roughly a century of production, from the first eagle struck in the New Republic to the last pre-1933 gold pieces minted before Franklin Roosevelt's executive order changed what it meant to own gold in America. She reached the second shelf, and her throat tightened. The cards here were different in their annotation, not the abbreviated condition grades of the earlier shelf, but full written descriptions, 2 or 3 lines each, identifying coins whose names she recognized from her research only because they appeared in lists of the rarest and most valuable American numismatic specimens in existence. An 1804 draped bust dollar, which she had read, was one of 15 known examples in the world, each of the 15 having sold for prices in the millions at major auction. An 1822 half-eagle, the gold $5 piece, of which 3 examples were known to exist, 2 of them in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution, and therefore permanently unavailable to private buyers. A set of 1907 ultra-high relief double eagles, the Augustus St. Gaudens design that President Theodore Roosevelt had personally commissioned, and which had been struck in such limited numbers that complete sets were essentially theoretical constructs. She stood in front of the second shelf for 6 minutes, not counting, but aware of the time passing around her. She stood there with the flashlight in her hand and looked at the coins her father and grandfather had gathered across more than 70 years of careful, patient, secret accumulation. And she thought about Harold at his kitchen table turning his coffee mug in his hands. And she thought about how you could know a person for 34 years and understand them completely and still be standing in a room beneath a $4,000 Springhouse looking at something that had no category in your prior understanding of the world. The third shelf held bullion, not coins in this case, but bars, stacked in the organized manner of a warehouse, each bar approximately the size and weight of a hardback book, their surfaces stamped with assay marks and serial numbers and the hallmark of refineries she recognized because she had looked them up. She counted the bars on the visible portion of the third shelf and did not finish counting because the count was already beyond 100, and the shelf extended further than the flashlight beam resolved cleanly. She walked to the fourth shelf, which held something different again. Bound volumes, ledger-sized, their covers labeled by year range in Harold's handwriting. The earliest read 1951 to 1963. The most recent read 2018 to 2022. She understood without opening them that these were the acquisition records, the documentation of every purchase, every source, every valuation, the complete provenance chain of everything in this room. She did not open them. That would come later, with a professional who understood what the documentation meant. She walked to the desk. She sat in the folding chair and put the flashlight upright on the desk so it lit the ceiling and bounced soft illumination back into the room, and she opened the envelope with her name on it. Harold had written more this time. The letter was 8 pages, front and back, the handwriting smaller than his usual style but consistent throughout, the writing of a man who had found his grip holding steady for an important document. He had written it, he said at the start, over the course of 3 days in October of the year before he died, sitting at his kitchen table in the early morning while it was still dark, because those were the hours when he thought most clearly, and because the letter contained things that required clarity above all else. He began with his own father, Thomas Garrison. Thomas had acquired the first pieces of the collection during the Depression, when gold coins were being turned in at banks following Roosevelt's executive order, and certain bank employees, understanding what they were handling in a way their institutions did not, preserved specific pieces that they believed should not be melted down. Thomas was one of those people who had provided a private home for preserved pieces, paying fair value in a time when fair value was worth considerably more than face value. He had done this quietly, storing what he accumulated in the space below the Springhouse that he and Elias Boone had constructed, using the Springhouse as the obvious surface above the non-obvious depth below. Harold had inherited the collection in 1974. At that point, it was worth, by his own careful estimate, approximately $12 million, a sum that had seemed to him both enormous and untenable to explain. He had made the decision his father had made, to maintain the collection privately, to add to it where he could, to keep the documentation meticulous, and to tell no one. He had not added extravagantly. The letter made this clear. He was not a speculator. He had purchased, over the following decades, specific pieces that his research identified as irreplaceable, that came available through private sales or estate liquidations, or the carefully maintained relationships of a community of serious collectors who did not, as a matter of professional culture, advertise their activities. He had paid fair prices, recorded every transaction, kept the provenance clean. He had not treated this as a financial instrument. He had treated it as what it was, a form of preservation, the same impulse that had driven his father, the understanding that certain things, once lost, were lost permanently, and that keeping them was a responsibility rather than an investment strategy. By the time Harold wrote the letter, in October, the collection had been independently valued. In a private assessment, conducted through a contact, he identified only by initials, at something in the range of $290 to $340 million, the range reflecting normal variability in rare numismatic valuation and current bullion pricing. He had written the central figure as $324 million, rounded, as the number he believed the collection would achieve under proper auction conditions with full provenance documentation. Clara sat with the letter in her hands for a moment after reading this passage. The number occupied space differently on the page than numbers usually did. She read it again to confirm that she had read it correctly the first time. She had read it correctly. Harold continued. He addressed the question of why he had said nothing during his lifetime. The answer was twofold. The first reason was that the collection's value made it a target, and a target required protection, and protection required secrecy, and secrecy required that as few people as possible know the thing existed. He had maintained this discipline for 50 years and did not feel comfortable breaking it. For the sake of a conversation he could accomplish more cleanly and safely through this letter and this room. The second reason was harder to write, he acknowledged. He had not told any of his 3 children because he had spent years watching all 3 of them, trying to understand which of them would do the right thing when confronted with something of this magnitude. And for most of those years, he had not been certain. In the last several years, however, he had become certain. Clara had demonstrated, through the accumulation of small, consistent actions, rather than any single dramatic gesture, that she understood what he valued and why he had valued it. Owen understood money. Margot understood comfort. Clara understood meaning, and meaning was what the collection required. He had structured the estate accordingly. Owen and Margot received assets that were appropriate to their relationship with the farm and with Harold. They received fair value, generous value by any reasonable measure. They received what a father who loved his children could give to children who were present in some ways and absent in others. Clara received the one thing that could not be divided or assessed by the county or listed in an estate inventory, because it lived in a private vault beneath a private structure on private land, and the law was clear about the distinction between real property and personal property in a private vault. And Douglas Whitmore had been explicit with Harold about what that distinction meant in practical terms. "Clara," Harold wrote near the end of the letter, "I know you are sitting in that room right now, feeling something complicated. Perhaps angry that I did not tell you. Perhaps overwhelmed by the scale of what you are looking at. Perhaps both, which would be the reasonable response. I want you to know that the secrecy was never about distrust. It was about protecting you from the weight of knowing before you were in a position to act on what you knew. You could not have done anything useful with this information while I was alive. Now you can. You have a deed, a clear chain of title, provenance documentation that goes back to 1933, and a lawyer who has already been briefed on the private vault distinction. What you do next is yours to decide. I have prepared the circumstances as carefully as I could. The rest is yours." He had signed it the way he signed his letters. H. Garrison. No closing sentiment. That was Harold. Below the signature, one additional line. "You are the one who showed up. It matters that I say that plainly." It always mattered. Clara sat in the folding chair in the vault beneath the Springhouse and let the silence of the room settle around her. The flashlight illuminated the ceiling, and the diffuse light it bounced back caught the edges of the coin cases and the surface of the bullion bars and the spines of the acquisition ledgers, and the vault her grandfather had built in 1951 held its temperature and its quiet with the composure of something that had been waiting patiently for the right person to arrive. She was not a person who cried easily. She had learned, over a decade of single parenthood and financial difficulty, and the particular discipline required, to drive 3 hours each way to fill someone's prescriptions and call it nothing remarkable, to manage emotion with the efficiency of a function that was legitimate but could not be allowed to interrupt necessary action. She sat in the vault for 12 minutes by her phone's clock, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was sitting inside. And then she stood up, folded the letter back into the envelope, put the envelope in her jacket pocket with the key, and went back up the ladder. She replaced the central stones carefully, matching each one to its position, using the orientation markers she had made, with a grease pencil on the edges, before removing them. She fitted the mortar-like fill back into the seams as best she could, not perfectly, not invisibly, but well enough for a casual observer who was not looking for a concealed vault. She would need to come back with proper materials to do the job correctly, but that could wait for the next visit, which she was already planning in her mind. She locked the vault door. She replaced the key in its envelope behind the rotating stone. She latched the Springhouse door as well as its single functioning hinge allowed. She walked back to her car in the February cold, put her bag in the trunk, and sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, looking at the bare sycamores against the pale sky. Then she called the phone number that Douglas Whitmore had given her at the end of his call, the number for the private assessor Harold had referenced in his letter, by initials only, whom Whitmore had identified as a man named Arthur Cade, formerly the senior numismatic specialist at a major auction house, now operating privately out of an office in Charlottesville. So Whitmore had said that Cade had signed a non-disclosure agreement in Harold's lifetime and was therefore already bound to confidentiality. He had also said that Cade had been expecting a call. Arthur Cade picked up on the second ring. He sounded like a man in his early 60s, his voice carrying the particular calibration of a specialist who had learned to discuss large numbers with the same equanimity as small ones. Because the numbers themselves were not the point, the significance of the objects behind the numbers was the point, and significance was a constant, regardless of the dollar denomination attached to it. "I assume you have been to the vault," he said. "I have," Clara said. "And you've read both letters?" "Yes." A short pause. She could hear him breathing. And in the breathing she recognized something she had felt herself 12 minutes ago in the folding chair, the quality of someone sitting with the awareness of what this meant. "Your father was an extraordinary man," Cade said. "I worked with 3 or 4 collections of genuine significance in 40 years in this field. His was the most carefully assembled private collection I have ever assessed. Not the largest in raw asset terms, but the most coherent. Everything in it belonged there. Every piece was chosen for a specific reason. The documentation is meticulous. There is not a single gap in the provenance chain that would raise a question at a major auction house." Clara asked the question she needed to ask. 324 million. Is that still the number? Cade was quiet for a moment. "Markets move," he said. "Rare numismatic assets don't move the way equities move, but they move. The bullion component is straightforward. Spot price adjusted for bar grade and hallmark. Currently approximately 18 million in that section of the collection alone. The coin collection is more complex. The valuation I provided to your father 2 years ago placed it at between 270 and 320 million, and that range accounted for the variability inherent in auction outcomes for genuinely rare material. Since that assessment, there have been 2 significant auction results for comparable pieces that have moved the upper bound. In current market conditions, with proper presentation and appropriate venue, and I would expect the collection to achieve somewhere between $315 and $340 million. 324 million was Harold's working figure. It was a reasonable working figure. It remains reasonable. Clara looked at the Springhouse through the windshield. The weathered door, the cracked east wall, the lichen on the north face. $4,200 by the county's assessment. By the county's assessment. "I need to understand the process," she said. "Documentation, verification, authentication. What happens first?" Cade walked her through it with the methodical patience of a professional, explaining something he had explained before, and continued to find worth explaining carefully. And the provenance ledgers would need to be reviewed and verified by an independent numismatic historian. The process took between 4 and 8 weeks, depending on the volume of records and their condition. individual high-value pieces would need to be examined by at least 2 independent grading services, the established professional bodies whose certification was required by major auction houses before a lot could be offered. The bullion would need assay verification, a simpler process, but one that still required transportation and chain of custody documentation. And before any of this began, she would need a lawyer, not Douglas Whitmore alone, but someone with specific expertise in high-value estate and asset law, who could advise her on the legal landscape around the vault's contents and ensure that the private vault distinction Harold and Whitmore had structured was properly understood and documented. "All of this will take time," Cade said. "Not weeks, months. But the time is not a problem. The vault has held for 73 years. It will hold for another 6 months while the process unfolds correctly. The worst thing you can do is move too quickly and leave gaps that can be exploited by anyone who might want to contest what you have." Clara absorbed this. She thought about Owen and Margot. She thought about the way Margot had made the not-quite-laugh sound. She thought about Owen's hands folded on his knee in Douglas Whitmore's office, the gesture that was their father's, and that Owen had never understood he'd inherited. "Does anyone else know?" Mishi asked. "About the vault specifically. Your father told me, and Douglas Whitmore, and presumably Elias Boone's family, though Boone himself has been dead for 36 years, and your father believed the knowledge died with him. Beyond that, to my knowledge, no." Clara said, "I would like to keep it that way for now." Cade said, "That is exactly what your father would have wanted." She drove back to Roanoke in the gray afternoon, with the same thermos of coffee, now cold, and the radio still off. The Shenandoah Hills were the same hills they had been this morning, and the sky was the same indecisive gray, and the car needed the same oil change, and the rent had been the same $89 since she left this morning, and none of it had changed. Everything had changed. The two facts sat beside each other in the car with her for 3 hours and 15 minutes without resolving into a single coherent reality, which was, she understood, what shock felt like when it arrived quietly rather than in a rush. She picked Nora up from Caden's house at 6:30. Nora climbed into the car smelling of someone else's dinner and carrying a drawing she had made at Caden's of a dog she wanted to get someday. A large, friendly-looking creature with improbable ears. She talked about her day with the unself-conscious detail of a child who had not yet learned to edit her narrative for relevance. Clara drove and listened and responded in the right places and felt the cold stone floor of the Springhouse under her hands and the weight of the vault door rising on its counterbalanced hinges and the scratch of her father's pen across 8 pages of October morning. At a red light 3 blocks from their apartment, Nora paused in her account of Caden's cat's opinion of the family hamster and looked at Clara with the perceptiveness she had gotten from somewhere that was neither Michael's family nor Clara's own obvious influence. "Did you go to the Springhouse?" she asked. "Yes," Clara said. "Did you find something?" Clara looked at her daughter. The light changed. She pressed the accelerator. "Yes, baby," she said. "We found something." Nora looked at the drawing of her imagined dog. And, Clara said, "I think Great-Grandpa left us exactly what he meant to leave us." Nora considered this for the length of the next block. Was it good? Clara thought about $324 million sitting in a vault below a crumbling stone springhouse in a Virginia field. Thought about 50 years of patient accumulation and the meticulous ledgers and the provenance that stretched back to the year Roosevelt changed the rules. Thought about Harold turning his coffee mug in hands that were growing unreliable. Thought about the last line of the second letter. "You are the one who showed up." It matters that I say that plainly. It always mattered. It was very good, she said. The following weeks moved in 2 registers simultaneously. the surface life continuing unchanged, the night shifts, and the invoices, and Nora's homework, and the routines that held things together, and beneath the surface, the careful, methodical work of preparation. She called the lawyer Cade recommended, a woman named Patricia Osei, who operated a boutique practice in Richmond, specializing in high-value personal property and estate law. Osei reviewed the situation with the brisk professional competence of someone who had seen similar structures before and understood immediately what Harold and Whitmore had constructed and why. She confirmed what Whitmore had told Clara. The vault's contents were not estate assets. They were private personal property belonging to the owner of the private structure in which they resided. The legal language was specific and well established, and Harold had, with Whitmore's guidance, structured everything to land precisely where he intended it to land. There will be challenges, Osei said, not as a warning, but as a professional assessment. When the contents of the vault become known, and they will become known eventually, because the authentication process requires disclosure to credentialed third parties, there will be people who attempt to claim an interest. Some of those people may be members of your family. It is important that you understand your position before that happens. Clara said she understood. Osei said, "Good. Because your position is extremely strong, and I want you to know that before anyone tries to convince you otherwise." Clara made 3 more trips to the Springhouse in the weeks that followed, each one planned around Nora's school schedule. On the first trip, she replaced the central floor stones properly, using the correct lime mortar mixture to match the original installation, doing the work carefully enough that the floor was essentially indistinguishable from what it had been before she disturbed it. On the second trip, she brought Arthur Cade, who descended into the vault with the quiet reverence of a man who had seen significant things and recognized this as being among the most significant. He spent 4 hours in the vault with his own lights and his own notation, moving methodically along the shelving, reading the acquisition records, examining individual cases with the magnification tools he carried in a leather case that looked older than some of the coins he was examining. He came up the ladder with an expression that told her nothing had been overstated. The third trip, she brought a structural engineer from Harrisonburg who assessed the Springhouse exterior and confirmed what Clara had already estimated, that the walls were sound, that the east wall crack was superficial and repairable, that the roof needed full replacement, and the door needed rehanging, and the frame needed leveling, and that with these repairs completed, the building would be structurally solid for another century. The repair estimate was $14,000. She did not have $14,000. She had by this point exactly $61 in checking. She called Patricia Osei and asked about the timeline for accessing the vault's liquid convertible assets. Osei explained that converting any portion of the collection to cash required completing the authentication process first, which was underway but required time. In the interim, however, the vault and its documented contents could serve as collateral for a short-term loan from a private lender specializing in this category of asset. Osei had 2 such lenders in her network. The process would take approximately 10 days. Clara said, "How much could we access?" Osei said, "Against a conservatively documented $300 million asset. How much do you need?" On the morning of the day she drove back to Millhaven to begin the repair work, Clara sat at her kitchen table and thought about her siblings. She thought about Owen's hands folded on his knee and Margot's not-quite laugh. She thought about the way Bless Her Heart had landed in that room and settled into her, without her visibly reacting. The way things landed when you had decided in advance not to let them show. She thought about what would happen when they learned about the vault. She thought about the way people who had dismissed something as worthless reconsidered their position once they understood what they had dismissed. She did not feel triumphant thinking about this. She felt the particular clarity of someone who understood that what was coming had its own logic and its own timeline, and could not be rushed or choreographed, that it would unfold the way all consequential things unfolded, in the order that events demanded rather than the order that satisfaction preferred. She thought about her father's last line. She picked up Nora's deep-sea book from the kitchen table, where it had been left the night before, and looked at the cover. The luminescent creatures in their deep darkness, making their own light in a place where no other light reached. She set the book back on the table. She called Nora in from the other room. "Put your coat on," she said. "We're going back to the Springhouse." Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway with Biscuit under one arm, wearing the expression she wore when she had been waiting for something to happen, and was pleased that it was finally happening. "Are we going to fix it?" she asked. "We're going to fix it," Clara said. Nora pulled her coat off the hook by the door. "Good," she said. "It's been waiting long enough." The Civic turned onto the highway toward Millhaven, with the oil change finally done, and the tank full, and the morning opening around them into the particular cold clarity of a February day that had decided to be beautiful rather than merely endurable. Clara drove with both hands on the wheel and let Nora read from the deep-sea book, half listening to descriptions of creatures that found ways to survive in total darkness by building their own light from within, and thought about stone floors and hollow sounds and what was possible when the thing you inherited turned out to be something no one else had known to value. $14,000 for the structural repairs. And against that, on the other side of a set of stone floor tiles and a steel vault door with a counterbalanced hinge, 324 million reasons that the Springhouse her siblings had dismissed with barely concealed amusement was going to become something that none of them, in their Richmond offices and their Northern Virginia dinner parties, had ever thought to imagine. The road curved north through the hills and the bare trees and the pale February sky, and ahead of them, somewhere along the eastern edge of a Virginia farmstead, a stone building built in 1843 was sitting between two sycamores, the way it had sat for the better part of 2 centuries, patient and solid, and keeping its particular secret, with the composure of something that had never been in any hurry and had always known the right person would come along eventually. The repair work began on the last Saturday of February, which arrived cold and bright in the way that late winter days sometimes did in the Shenandoah Valley. The sky a clean, hard blue that made everything it touched look more deliberate than usual. Clara had arranged for Nora to be with her on this first working day, on school being out for a teacher development Friday that had extended into the weekend, and Nora had arrived at the Springhouse wearing her oldest clothes and carrying her own small work gloves, which she had located in the apartment closet and brought without being asked. They started with the door. The surviving hinge was sound. The missing hinge required a replacement that Clara had ordered from a hardware supplier in Charlottesville, a period-appropriate iron piece that matched the original in gauge and style, because the Springhouse was going to be repaired correctly, or not at all, and because Harold Garrison had built things to last, and she intended to honor that in the way she understood how. She hung the new hinge herself, Nora holding the door steady at the correct angle, while Clara drove the screws, on both of them leaning into the work with the focused attention of people who understood that precision here prevented problems later. When the door swung open and closed on both hinges without catching, Nora clapped with the same unself-conscious satisfaction she brought to any task completed correctly. Then the roof. The roofing contractor Clara had hired through the structural engineer's recommendation arrived the following Thursday. A woman named Patrice Holloway, who ran a 3-person crew out of Staunton and who had spent 20 years working on historic agricultural structures in the Shenandoah region. Patrice walked the perimeter of the Springhouse with the assessing eye of someone for whom fieldstone buildings were a professional language. Read the east wall crack in about 45 seconds, and said the same thing the structural engineer had said. Superficial. Pointing needed. No structural compromise to the underlying fabric. The tin roof she described as a mercy removal. She pulled it off in a single morning and replaced it over 2 days with standing seam copper that would oxidize to green within a few years. And would last, Patrice said without exaggeration, longer than anyone currently living would be around to observe. Clara watched the copper go on from the ground and thought about the acquisition ledgers in the vault below, the careful handwriting spanning 7 decades, and understood that she was participating in something that had its own long view, regardless of whether she had chosen it consciously. The east wall crack was pointed by a mason Patrice recommended through a man named Gerald, who worked in lime mortar exclusively and who handled the Garrison fieldstone with the particular respect of a craftsman encountering quality older than himself. The door frame was leveled, and the door re-hung in its corrected plane. The 2 windows were re-glazed with original weight glass sourced from a salvage supplier in Richmond. The spring channel was cleaned of 7 decades of sediment accumulation, and the outlet opening at the south wall base was repointed to prevent further blockening. By the 3rd week of March, the Springhouse stood repaired in the way that things are repaired when the person doing the repairing is not in a hurry and has reasons that go beyond the cosmetic. Nora photographed the process on Clara's phone with the documentary instinct of someone who understood intuitively that before and after required evidence of both. She labeled the photographs in a note on the phone with the careful handwriting she brought to things she considered important. Door, broken to fixed. Roof, holes to copper. Wall, cracked to mended. The collection grew across the weeks into a record of transformation that Clara found herself returning to in the late nights when she was sitting at the kitchen table with the fluorescent light buzzing and the invoices waiting, needing to see evidence that hard work produced visible results. It was Owen who discovered something was happening, and not because he was perceptive about Clara's situation, but because he had hired a property management company to assess the full Garrison estate on his behalf, and the property manager, driving the eastern boundary to inspect fence lines, had seen the new copper roof catching March light from the road. Owen called Clara on a Wednesday evening, his voice carrying the calibrated ease of a man initiating a conversation he had already scripted. He asked how she was doing. She said fine. He said he had heard she had been spending time at the Springhouse, which he offered as a neutral observation. She said she had been making some repairs. He said that was interesting. And then he said the thing he had called to say, which was that he and Margot had been talking, and they felt that perhaps the will settlement had been somewhat imbalanced, and they wondered whether Clara might be open to a conversation about restructuring the division of the estate in a way that was more equitable for everyone involved. Clara asked what he meant by equitable. Owen said he meant fair. He said that the Springhouse had turned out to be more interesting than anyone had anticipated, and that family assets should benefit the whole family, and that he and Margot were certainly not suggesting anything adversarial, just a collaborative conversation between people who all wanted the best outcome. Clara said she would have her lawyer reach out to his. The silence that followed was brief, but complete. Owen had not expected a lawyer. He had expected, she understood, the version of Clara who drove 3 hours to fill prescriptions and said nothing about it, honored the version who accepted what was given and expressed gratitude for its acceptance. He recovered smoothly because he was a man who recovered smoothly. Said of course that made sense. He looked forward to the conversation and ended the call with the pleasantness of someone who had not yet understood what he was dealing with. Patricia Osei made 2 phone calls and sent 1 letter. The letter was 4 pages of precise legal language establishing, with reference to the specific statutes Harold and Whitmore had identified, and to the deed of conveyance, and to the private vault distinction that Osei could cite in her sleep, that the contents of the vault beneath the Springhouse structure on the 0.8-acre parcel belonging to Clara Garrison Whitfield were private personal property, not subject to estate claims, not subject to division among heirs, and not open to challenge on any theory of constructive trust or unjust enrichment that Owen and Margot's attorneys might wish to raise, because the structure of Harold's planning had been specifically designed to preclude each such theory in turn. The letter was, Osei told Clara when she called to describe it, a door closed from the inside. There was no mechanism available to Owen and Margot that would open it from the outside. She was right. Owen's attorney reviewed Osei's letter and called Owen, and whatever that conversation contained, produced 4 days later a brief email to Osei from Owen's counsel acknowledging the position and indicating that the Garrison family did not intend to pursue further action. Margot's attorney never responded at all, which was a form of response. Clara read Osei's summary of the exchange at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning before the night shift. She sat with it for a moment, and then set her phone down and drank her coffee, and thought about what it felt like when something you had been bracing against did not arrive with the force you had been bracing for. It felt, she decided, less like triumph than like the sudden absence of weight. Like setting down something you had carried so long you had forgotten it had a specific gravity. The authentication process completed in the 2nd week of April. Arthur Cade delivered his final report to Patricia Osei, who forwarded it to Clara with a cover note that said, simply, "Your father's documentation was extraordinary." The grading services had certified the 43 highest value coins individually. The provenance chain was clean throughout. The bullion assay confirmed 4,062 troy ounces in bar form at current spot pricing. 2 major auction houses, presented with Cade's report under confidentiality protocols, had submitted preliminary interest letters within 72 hours of receiving it. Both letters used the word significant. One used the word exceptional. Clara called Arthur Cade that evening from the parking lot of the logistics building where she worked, sitting in her Civic with the engine running, because the April nights still carried cold in the Shenandoah at elevation. She asked him what came next. Cade said the decision was hers entirely. She could liquidate the full collection through a major auction event, which would maximize exposure and competitive bidding and likely achieve the upper end of the valuation range. She could sell selectively, retaining pieces she wished to preserve in family ownership and converting the remainder to cash. She could donate a portion to institutional collections, which would generate significant tax benefit and the kind of permanent attribution that museum plaques carried. Or she could hold the collection and wait, because rare numismatic assets in this condition with this provenance did not depreciate. "What would you do?" she asked him. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing honesty over professional deflection. "I would keep the pieces that cannot be replaced," he said. "There are perhaps 15 coins in that vault that are, in the technical sense, irreplaceable, but unique or nearly unique specimens whose loss from private to institutional hands or from the market entirely would be a diminishment. I would donate those to institutions where they belong and where they will be cared for properly. The remainder I would sell. The coins have been kept in the dark long enough. Things that extraordinary deserve to be seen." Clara thought about her father turning his coffee mug. She thought about the acquisition ledger spanning 70 years of careful, patient choosing. She thought about the 1822 half-eagle on the second shelf, one of 3 known examples in the world, and about the Smithsonian, where the other 2 had lived for a century. "Set up the donation process for the irreplaceables," she said, "and schedule the auction for the rest." The auction was held in late May at a major house in New York. The event structured as a private sale open to registered collectors and institutional buyers, because Cade had advised that the collection's coherence was better honored by a curated event than a public spectacle. Clara attended on the day of the principal sale, driving up with Nora on a Thursday morning because she had decided some time ago that Nora would be present when this concluded. She wore the navy suit jacket she had bought secondhand for a job interview and never worn for anything else until the day of Harold's funeral. And she told Nora to wear her best dress, the blue one with small white flowers that Nora considered appropriate for occasions that mattered. They sat in the room as the lots were called and the numbers came in. And the numbers were what Cade had said they would be. The rare coin lots drove competitive bidding that pushed final prices above estimate in 11 of the top 20 lots. The bullion converted cleanly. By 4 in the afternoon, when the final lot closed, the aggregate was $318 million before commission and applicable fees, which settled after Osei's accounting at $294 million net. Clara sat in the auction room with Nora beside her and a number in her head that did not feel like a number so much as a reconfiguration of the possible. And she thought about the fluorescent light above her kitchen stove and the $47 in her wallet on the morning of Harold's funeral and the not-quite laugh sound Margot had made in Douglas Whitmore's office. And she felt none of the things that stories about sudden wealth suggested she should feel. She felt instead the particular calm of someone who had arrived somewhere after a long walk and recognized the place from a description she had been given a long time ago but had never quite believed was real. Nora, who had been sitting quietly through the afternoon with biscuit in her lap and a patience that exceeded what most 8-year-olds were issued, looked up at her mother when the final number was confirmed on the display board at the front of the room. She said, "Is that ours?" "Yes, baby," Clara said. "That's ours." Nora looked at the number for a moment. Then she looked at Biscuit. Then she said, "Can we get the dog now?" Clara laughed, which was the first time she had laughed without calculation in as long as she could remember, on a real laugh that came from somewhere below the careful management of emotion and arrived without asking permission. "Yes," she said. "We can get the dog." The months that followed moved differently than the months before them. Not faster, not easier in the superficial sense, but with a different quality of weight. The first things Clara addressed were the practical ones, because she was a practical person, and because the practical things were the ones that had been grinding against her for the longest. The rent situation resolved itself when she purchased the small house 3 blocks from Nora's school that she had looked at twice on real estate sites and closed the tab on both times before the numbers became visible. The Civic received its oil change and then was retired in favor of something less likely to strand them on the highway between Roanoke and Millhaven. The shoes Nora needed were purchased without the particular arithmetic of which budget category they came from. She called the logistics company on a Monday morning, not the supervisor, but the main office number, and left a message resigning her position effective immediately. She stood in her new kitchen after making the call and listened to the sound of the house around her, which did not include a buzzing stove light, and thought about $11.40 an hour and decided that was a thought she did not need to continue having. For Harold, she established the Garrison Foundation, a small private charitable organization focused on agricultural preservation in the Shenandoah Valley region, funding the documentation and maintenance of historic farm structures and the continuation of farming practices that commercial development pressure was making economically non-viable. The foundation's first grant went to the Millhaven County Agricultural Trust. Its second went to the family that farmed the land adjacent to the Garrison property's eastern boundary, to fund the equipment repair they had been deferring for 2 seasons because the numbers had not permitted it. For the 15 coins she had donated to institutions, the attributions read, "Gift of the Garrison Family Collection." Harold's name in the card below the case in the Smithsonian Gallery, where the 1822 half-eagle now resided beside its 2 siblings, for reuniting the 3 known examples for the first time in the history of their documentation. She had gone to see it on a visit to Washington with Nora in September, standing in front of the case in the dimmed gallery light, looking at the small gold coin that her grandfather had acquired in 1961, and her father had tended for 60 years in a sealed vault beneath a stone floor. Nora had stood beside her with the deep-sea book tucked under one arm, looking at the coin with the respectful attention of someone who understood. She was looking at something that had no replacement. "Great-grandpa kept this safe for a really long time," Nora said. 60 years, Clara said. Nora thought about this. "That's longer than I've been alive. Much longer." Nora looked at the card with Harold's name on it. "But now everyone can see it. That's better, right?" Clara looked at her daughter. "Yes," she said. "That's better." Owen called once, in June, 3 weeks after the auction results had become public through the auction house's standard post-sale release. The call lasted 4 minutes. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings. He said he was glad things had worked out for her. He said Dad always had his reasons for things, and he supposed this was one of them. He said Margot sent her best. Clara said she hoped they were well. She said she didn't have hard feelings. Both of these things were true in the way that complicated things were true, partially and without the fullness that simpler truths possessed, but true enough to say without dishonesty. She did not tell Owen that she had spent a week after the auction sitting with exactly what hard feelings felt like and deciding what to do with them, and that what she had decided was that they were less useful than the alternative, which was the energy she had been expending on them redirected toward the things that were worth building. She did not say this because Owen had not asked, and because some understandings were not for sharing. The Springhouse she did not sell and did not convert. Patricia Osei had asked about her plans for the structure, framing it as a practical question about property management and tax classification. Clara had thought about it for a day before answering. "The Springhouse stays as it is," she said. "Repaired, with the vault intact below it." Osei said that was an unusual choice for an asset management perspective. Clara said, "It's not an asset. It's a record. It's where my grandfather built something important, and my father kept something important, and I found something important. Some places are worth keeping as places, rather than converting them into something else." Osei said she understood, and the particular quality of the way she said it suggested that she did. On the day they picked up the dog, a Friday in early October, with the Virginia autumn doing the thing it did when it committed fully to the season, the light going gold through the trees along the road, and the air carrying the particular smell of leaf and cold creek water and distance, Nora named him immediately upon seeing him. She said the name before they had finished filling out the paperwork at the shelter, looking at the large, mixed-breed animal who was investigating her sneakers, with the focused attention of someone conducting thorough due diligence. "Garrison," Nora said. Clara looked up from the paperwork. "After great-grandpa," Nora said. "Because he found us our house." Clara looked at her daughter, 8 years old, and holding the end of a shelter lid with both hands, completely certain about the name of a dog she had known for 4 minutes. She thought about Harold at his kitchen table in October, writing 8 pages in the early morning dark, getting the words right. She thought about the combination he had left her. She thought about the key behind the third stone from the left, at shoulder height, the envelope with her name on it, in his handwriting, and the way that handwriting had felt when she held the envelope. The particular physical weight of a thing that a specific person had touched with intention and care. She thought about "You are the one who showed up," and she thought about "It matters that I say that plainly." And she thought that the man who had written those words in a sealed room on an October morning would have found something quietly satisfying about a dog named Garrison sitting in his great-granddaughter's lap in a car driving home. "Garrison," she said. "That's a good name." Nora settled the dog across her lap with the confident authority of a child who has waited for something long enough to know exactly how to receive it when it finally arrives. Garrison endured this arrangement with the dignified patience of a dog who had decided, in the 4 minutes of their acquaintance, that this was his family and had no reservations about the assignment. Clara drove. The road curved through the autumn hills toward home, and beside her and behind her, the two beings she was responsible for occupied the car with the comfortable weight of things that had found their right place. And the morning light came through the glass, the way morning light came through glass when the glass was clean, and the sky had decided to be clear. And everything was exactly as ordinary and as extraordinary as it had always been, because that was what life looked like when you had stopped spending your energy on what you had lost and started spending it on what you were building. The Springhouse stood on the eastern edge of the Garrison property in its repaired condition, the copper roof beginning its long, slow shift toward green, the door hanging true on both hinges, the spring running in its channel through the clean stone floor. The vault below was secured and documented and accounted for and attached to a legal record that Patricia Osei had called ironclad, with the professional satisfaction of someone who had built something they expected to last. The acquisition ledgers sat in archival storage in a climate-controlled facility in Richmond, their 7 decades of careful handwriting preserved for as long as preservation technology continued to advance. The 15 irreplaceable coins occupied their gallery cases in 4 institutions, attributed in perpetuity to the family that had kept them, and the $4,200 inheritance that her brother and sister had accepted with barely concealed amusement. The crumbling stone shed in the eastern field that had warranted a not-quite laugh and a "bless her heart" and an offer of $6,000 to make the inconvenience disappear, had turned out to be the thing that Harold Garrison valued most, which was the accumulated work of a family that understood the meaning of patient accumulation, held in trust for the one person he had been certain would understand it. The one who showed up. It had always mattered. It had always been enough. It had just needed time to become visible, the way most things that mattered needed time to become visible, the way springs ran beneath stone floors for centuries before the right person came along and thought to knock. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. See you in the next story.